Get ready for market mayhem. We're diving into the TSX hottest stocks for the week of July 13th, with NorthFlow Finance AI's top 10 picks. Let's review. Welcome to our weekly review segment, where we're taking a closer look at stock number 1, GQC.V, a company that caught our attention on July 13th, when our system detected a signal. This signal was triggered due to a combination of a moving average golden cross and a significant volume surge, indicating potential upward momentum for the stock. The moving average golden cross, combined with a volume surge of 75.2%, suggested that GQC.V was poised for a potential breakout, and with an RSI of 45.8 at the time, it seemed like the stock had some room to run. This signal typically indicates that the stock is transitioning from a downtrend to an uptrend, and the volume surge added further conviction to this trend reversal. At the time, the entry price was 77 cents, which provided a relatively low-risk entry point for investors looking to capitalize on this potential momentum shift. This week, however, GQC.V declined by 4.0%, opening at 76 cents, reaching a high of 84 cents, and a low of 68 cents, before closing at 73 cents. Despite this decline, the stock did show some resilience, bouncing back from its lows, which could be seen as a validation of the original signal. The weekly performance was somewhat mixed, but it's worth noting that the stock is still trading above its recent lows. The fact that it was able to find support and bounce back suggests that the underlying trend may still be intact. In recent news, there's been some discussion around Goldquest Mining's cash burn rate, with some analysts suggesting that it's not a major concern at this point. This could be a factor in the stock's ability to hold its ground despite the broader market volatility, as investors seem to be looking beyond the company's short-term cash flow and focusing on its long-term potential. This positive sentiment could continue to support the stock in the coming weeks. As we look ahead to next week, investors should watch for whether GQC.V can regain its upward momentum and break above its recent highs. If the stock can manage to do so, it could be a sign that the original signal is still valid, and the trend reversal is still in play. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're taking a look at stock number 2 of 10, which is Whitecap Resources, ticker symbol WCP.TO, and the signal was detected on July 13, 2026. This signal was particularly interesting as it indicated a potential buying opportunity for investors. The MA Golden Cross Plus volume surge signal is a strong indicator of a potential trend reversal, and when we saw it on July 13, it meant that the stock's short-term moving average had crossed above its long-term moving average, accompanied by a significant surge in volume, which was up 68.2%. At the time, the RSI was at 51.5, which is relatively neutral, but the volume surge and the MA Golden Cross suggested that the stock might be gaining momentum. This signal is often seen as a bullish indicator, and investors were likely watching to see if the stock would continue to rise. This week, WCP.TO gained 3.0%, opening at $15.52, reaching a high of $16.02, and a low of $15.30, before closing at $15.99. This performance is somewhat validating of the original signal, as the stock has continued to trend upwards, although the gains are relatively modest. The stock is still holding above its moving averages, which is a positive sign, and the volume has remained relatively strong. There was a recent headline that caught our attention, suggesting that investors should be cautious when considering buying Whitecap Resources for its upcoming dividend, which may have had some impact on the stock's weekly performance. The article's concerns may have tempered some of the enthusiasm for the stock, but overall, the stock's fundamentals still look strong. The caution may be related to the stock's valuation or other factors, but it's worth keeping an eye on. Looking ahead to next week, investors should watch for whether WCP.TO can continue to build on its recent gains, and whether the volume can remain strong. We'll also be keeping an eye on any news or announcements that may impact the stock's performance. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're reviewing stock number 3 of 10, LNR.TO, where a signal was detected on July 13, 2026. The signal was picked up on this particular day, and it's been an interesting week for this stock. The MA Golden Cross Plus volume surge signal indicated a potential trend reversal or continuation, with the moving averages crossing over and a significant surge in volume, up 59.0%, which can be a powerful combination. At the time, the RSI was at 44.3, not overbought or oversold, so there was room for movement. This signal suggested that the stock might be gaining momentum, and investors should take notice. This stock gained 2.7% this week, it opened at $100.96, reached a high of $104.88 and a low of $98.58, closing at $103.66. This performance seems to validate the original signal, as the stock has continued to move upward. The stock's ability to hold its gains and close near its high for the week is a positive sign. There's been a recent headline asking if it's too late to consider Linamar after its strong one-year share price run, and this week's performance suggests that there may still be room for growth. The fact that the stock is still moving upward after a strong year could indicate that investors are still optimistic about its future prospects. Viewers should watch for continued momentum and whether the stock can break through its recent high next week. The stock's ability to hold above $100 will be an important indicator of its future direction. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're taking a look at stock number 4 of 10, which is ATH.TO, and the signal was detected on July 13th, so let's dive into the details. The signal we detected was a moving average golden cross combined with a volume surge, which is a pretty strong indicator of potential upward momentum. The MA golden cross indicates that the short-term moving average has crossed above the long-term moving average, which can be a sign of a trend reversal, and when you combine that with a volume surge of 47.4%, it's a pretty compelling signal. At the time of the signal, the RSI was at 52.3, which is relatively neutral, so it wasn't showing any signs of overbought or oversold conditions. The entry price was $10.91, so we were looking for this stock to potentially move higher from there. This week, ATH.TO gained 1.6%, which is a relatively modest move, but it did reach a high of $11.23 and a low of $10.53, before closing at $10.76. This performance is somewhat validating the original signal, as the stock is still moving in the right direction, but we'd like to see a bit more momentum. The stock did open at $10.59, so it's still holding above that level, which is a positive sign. There was a recent headline suggesting that some TSX stocks, including potentially ATH.TO, are trading at discounts of up to 48%, which could be a factor in the stock's recent move. If this stock is indeed undervalued, we could see further upward momentum, and this week's gain could be just the beginning. The fact that it's being highlighted as a potential discount could bring more attention to the stock and potentially drive the price higher. As we look ahead to next week, we'll be watching to see if ATH.TO can continue to build on this momentum and potentially break out above the $11 level. We'll also be keeping an eye on the volume to see if it can continue to support the stock's move higher. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're taking a look at stock number 5 of 10, which is ARTG.V, and a signal was detected on July 14, 2026. This signal is one we've been watching closely as it could indicate a potential trend reversal for the stock. The MA Golden Cross Plus volume surge signal is a strong indicator that a stock is about to experience a significant uptrend, and at the time, it meant that ARTG.V was likely to see some increased buying pressure, with the RSI at 61.2, which is not overly extended, and a volume surge of 181.8%, which is a significant increase. This signal was particularly interesting given the entry price of $34.50. The combination of the golden cross and the volume surge suggested that the stock was poised for a breakout. This week, ARTG.V declined by 0.7%, which may seem counterintuitive given the strong signal we saw last week. It opened at $31.88, reached a high of $35.65, and a low of $30.69, before closing at $31.67. Despite the decline, the stock's ability to hold above $30 is a positive sign, and it suggests that the original signal is still valid. In terms of recent news, there's been a lot of discussion around the valuation of Artemis Gold, particularly with regards to the growth at Blackwater, and how that's driving some contrasting signals in the market. This could be contributing to the stock's recent volatility, and it's something we'll be keeping a close eye on. The article highlights the potential for growth, but also notes that there are some challenges ahead. As we look ahead to next week, we'll be watching to see if ARTG.V can bounce back from this week's decline, and whether it can break through the $35 resistance level. We'll also be keeping an eye on the overall market trend, and how that affects the stock's performance. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're taking a look at stock number 6 of 10, which is GSKR.V, and the signal was detected on July 6, 2026. This signal caught our attention as it presented an interesting opportunity for investors. The MA Golden Cross Plus volume surge signal is a strong indicator of a potential trend reversal, and when we saw this signal on July 6, it meant that the stock's short-term moving average had crossed above its long-term moving average, accompanied by a significant increase in trading volume, which was up 295.5%. At the time, the RSI was at 51.5, indicating a relatively neutral momentum. This combination of factors suggested that the stock might be poised for a rally. This week, however, the stock declined 6.3%, which is not what we were hoping for after that strong signal. It opened at $3.16, reached a high of $3.33, and a low of $2.92, before closing at $2.96. This performance does raise some questions about whether the original signal was a false positive, but we need to consider other factors as well. In recent news, Gold Sky Resources has made some key appointments, including a new CFO and a senior vice president of exploration and resource development, which could potentially have a positive impact on the company's operations and future prospects. This news may have been overshadowed by the stock's decline this week, but it's worth keeping an eye on how these new appointments affect the company's performance going forward. As we look ahead to next week, investors should watch for whether the stock can bounce back from this decline and whether the new management appointments can help drive growth. We'll be keeping a close eye on the stock's volume and momentum to see if it can regain its upward trajectory. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're taking a closer look at stock number 7, Moon.V, where we detected a signal on May 26, 2026. This signal was triggered by a moving average golden cross combined with a significant volume surge, which caught our attention as a potential buying opportunity. The moving average golden cross, as you know, is a bullish indicator that occurs when the short-term moving average crosses above the long-term moving average, and when combined with a volume surge of 250.7%, it suggested a strong upward momentum in the stock. At the time of the signal, the RSI was at 58.7, which is relatively neutral, but the volume surge was the key driver of our interest. The entry price was $9.95, and we were expecting the stock to continue its upward trend. However, this week the stock declined 13.8%, which is a significant drop, opening at $9.30, reaching a high of $9.31, and a low of $7.86, before closing at $8.02. This decline raises questions about the validity of the original signal, and we need to reassess the stock's potential. The drop in price may have been an overreaction, or it could be a sign of a larger trend reversal. In recent news, Blue Moon Metals announced an agreement to combine its NSG unit with Alpha Future Funds VMS, which could have implications for the company's future growth and profitability. This deal may have contributed to the stock's volatility this week, as investors react to the potential changes in the company's structure and strategy. As we look ahead to next week, we'll be watching to see if the stock can recover from this decline and regain its upward momentum. Viewers should keep an eye on the stock's volume and RSI, as these indicators will provide clues about the stock's future direction. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're taking a look at stock number 8 of 10, which is TOI.V, and the signal was detected on July 15, 2026. This signal was quite interesting, as it indicated a potential buying opportunity for investors. The MACD bullish crossover plus volume surge signal is a strong indicator of a trend reversal, and at the time, it suggested that TOI.V was poised for a potential uptrend, given the significant volume surge of 36.8%. The Relative Strength Index, or RSI, was at 45.9, which is relatively neutral, but the MACD crossover was a clear bullish signal. With the entry price at $92.55, investors were likely expecting a move upwards. This stock gained 1.6% this week, which is a relatively modest move, but still a positive one. It opened at $90.77, reached a high of $97.30, and a low of $89.80, before closing at $92.23. While the gain is not extremely significant, it does validate the original signal to some extent, as the stock is still trending upwards. There was a recent article suggesting that some TSX stocks, including potentially TOI.V, may be undervalued, which could be a factor in the stock's recent performance. The idea that the stock may be priced below its estimated value could be attracting investors and contributing to the upward trend. This undervaluation, if true, could lead to further gains in the coming weeks. Going forward, viewers should watch for whether TOI.V can continue its upward trend, and whether the volume surge will be sustained. Additionally, investors should keep an eye on any news or updates that could impact the stock's value and validate the original signal. Now let's move on to our next stock. Welcome back to our weekly review segment. I'm your analyst for NorthFlow Finance, and today we're discussing stock number 9 of 10, MFC.2, where a signal was detected on July 15th. This signal caught our attention, and we're going to break it down for you. The MACD bullish crossover plus volume surge signal indicated a potential buying opportunity, as the moving average convergence-divergence line crossed over the signal line, and we saw a significant increase in volume, 36% to be exact, which is a strong indication of buyer interest. At the time, the relative strength index was at 81.8, which is somewhat elevated, but the volume surge added conviction to the signal. The entry price was $60.48, and we're going to see how that played out. This stock gained 3.9% this week, opening at $58.49, reaching a high of $61.01, and a low of $57.95, closing at $60.74. This performance seems to validate the original signal, as the stock continued to trend upward. The move upward was somewhat expected, given the strength of the signal, and it's good to see the stock holding its gains. There's been some positive news surrounding MFC, as it's been outperforming its industry and hitting a 52-week high, which is likely contributing to its recent gains. This is a significant development, and investors are taking notice, which could lead to further upward momentum. The company's strong performance is definitely a factor in its recent success. As we look ahead to next week, viewers should watch for any potential pullbacks, as well as continued industry outperformance, which could drive the stock even higher. We'll be keeping a close eye on MFC.2 to see if it can maintain its momentum, and what that might mean for investors. Now let's move on to our next stock. We're taking a look at TIH.TO, a stock that caught our attention when our system detected a signal on July 17th. This signal was triggered by a moving average golden cross combined with a significant volume surge, which is a pretty strong indicator of potential upward momentum. The MA golden cross plus volume surge signal is a bullish indicator that suggests a potential trend reversal, and in this case, it was backed up by a nearly 99.1% increase in volume, which is a clear sign of investor interest. At the time, the relative strength index was at 54.3, which is relatively neutral, but the golden cross and volume surge took precedence. This signal indicated that the stock was poised for a potential breakout, and investors who got in at the entry price of $235.76 may have been expecting some upside. This stock had a pretty solid week, gaining 2.7%, and it's worth noting that it opened at $229.50, reached a high of $236.40, and a low of $225.21, before closing at $235.76. This performance seems to validate the original signal, as the stock has held its ground and even gained some ground. The stock's ability to close at the same price as our entry point suggests that the signal was correct, and we may see further gains. The weekly high and low also suggest that the stock is still finding its footing. There's been some recent news that may be relevant to this stock's performance, as CIBC has raised its price targets for several companies in the industry, including Toromont Industries. This could be a sign that the sector as a whole is gaining momentum, and TIH.TO may be benefiting from this trend. The price target increase is likely a result of the company's strong performance, and this could lead to further gains for the stock. Looking ahead to next week, investors should keep an eye on whether this stock can continue to build on its recent gains, and whether the moving averages will continue to support the uptrend. We'll also be watching to see if the volume surge was a one-time event or if it's a sign of sustained investor interest. That wraps up our weekly review. Subscribe for daily TSX signals from NorthFlow Finance. Thanks for tuning in, subscribe for more, and remember, this is not financial advice, consult a professional before making decisions.